My name is Brenna Tubers, and I am going to be the moderator for this session. I am with the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative, and I am a Ho-Chunk, Navajo, and Standing Rock person from Flagstaff, Arizona. And I am currently on the unceded territories of the Council of Three Fires, which is the Potawatomi, Odawa, and Ojibwe, as well as my tribe, the Ho-Chunk Nation. And so thank you all for joining, and I'm super excited to have you here. So welcome to Building Power After Biden's Climate Summit, a Global South perspective. This session is going to be co-hosted by, Care About Climate, the International Student Environmental Coalition, and the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative. Today, we are going to hold a critical discussion of the global implications of US policy on climate change from the Leaders Summit on Climate yesterday, as well as today. So our speakers are going to cover the moral obligation of the US and northern countries to the global south and critique the summit on what implementation has traditionally looked like. And I just want to point out that there is a closed captioning button available at the bottom for a live transcript. But today we wanted to talk about how President Biden has hosted 40 world leaders yesterday at the Leaders Summit on Climate in an effort to catalyze the efforts to keep within the 1.5 degrees Celsius goal set by the Paris Agreement, also known as a lot of talk and not a lot of action. So we wanted to point out that this approach is inherently colonial. Even some of the other countries that our speakers are from, they were not invited. And this means that, they agreed technically to achieve emissions reductions consistent with limiting global temperature rise to the Paris Agreement's 1.5 degrees Celsius, as well as provide support for emergent countries and frontline communities that bear the brunt of climate change. So even though President Biden returned the US to the Paris Agreement, this country and a host of other countries continue their legacy of colonization and imperialism today, including the UK, France, Canada, Australia, etc. And when you think about the things that are happening in the US alone, for example, the fossil fuel industry received $30 billion in subsidies throughout 2020. And so that's taxpayers' dollars that are being put towards the fossil fuel industry. And so yesterday in Biden's climate finance plan, he talked about ending international investments in and support for carbon-intensive fossil fuel-based energy projects. So this is an issue that has been happening throughout the past year. It's something that was semi-addressed yesterday, but it is not enough. And so that is kind of an example of what we're going to be doing today. And until we can address the climate crisis as a direct result of capitalism, degradation, and a deep injustice to BIPOC, that's Black, Indigenous, and people of color everywhere, we will never truly root out the deep cause of the current global climate crisis. And so we also want to take a moment to give thanks and recognize the unending fights of communities around the world for things like DAPL, things like EOPA, things like TMX, and others, and want to show that we can lead by example by working from the ground up and really learning and supporting and uplifting the fights around the world. And before I introduce our speakers, I just wanted to leave you all with a little something that my elders taught me, which was this idea of the seventh generation. And that means looking ahead to the impacts of everything that we do for the next 7 generations. And to me, that isn't something that is so far off. Those are relatives that are alive and well. And right now, their lives are in danger because of the continued climate crisis that the governments around the world have continued to fund and put policies in place to back them up. And it is something that is really deep and meaningful that all of our speakers today are going to touch upon. And so with that, I would like to introduce to you all of our speakers. We have Krishnal Narayan is he is the director and principal consultant at Sustainable Future Consultancy in Fiji. He founded the Project Survival Pacific, where he now sits on the board of directors. He is also one of the board of directors for Care About Climate, and Krishnal has championed the priorities of the small island developing states in the United Nations for more than a decade. Next, we have Alvaro Morales. He is from Chile, and he is a master's student in international relations at the Pontifical Catholic University of Valparaiso with a postgraduate certificate in international relations and an education major. Since 2019, he has been deeply involved as a leader in the youth movement and climate movement, attending certain events like COP25, COI 15, SE for All, ARENA, SDG 7, the UNFCCC, and UNSCCD. So that's a lot of acronyms that I just threw at you right now. But I think we have some of those listed in that list of acronyms and terms. And next up, we have Jesse Masazi. He is a climate justice activist from Kampala, Uganda. He serves as co-executive director of the International Student Environmental Coalition and previously has served as the national director of the International Student Environmental Coalition Uganda since 2017. Next we have Iman Bashir as the environmental scientist and lawyer from Nairobi, Kenya. She works with PowerShift Africa, a climate policy think tank that seeks to amplify the African voice at international climate conversations. She is also the Africa lead for the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, a global movement seeking to prevent the proliferation of fossil fuels and fast track a just and equitable transition to cleaner energy solutions. And last but certainly not least, we have Harjit Singh. He is the co-founder of Satat Sampada and supports the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative as a strategic advisor for global partnerships. He has led ActionAid International's climate change work globally, and he is an expert on the issues of climate impacts, migration, and adaptation, and supports countries across the world on tackling climate change. He's a member of the United Nations Technical Expert Group on Comprehensive Risk Management under the Warsaw International Mechanism for Loss and Damage. So, all of these amazing people that I'm super excited to be working with and to hear from. Our first question goes out to the panel in general. In the US's nationally determined contribution, their NDC, the US lays out their commitment to stay at the 1.5 degrees Celsius limit set by the Paris Agreement. Yesterday, the Biden administration's revised NDC promised to cut emissions by about 50% by 2030, which is just one of many disappointing promises. Would these actions be enough to get us to the 1.5 degrees Celsius limit, despite the lack of an equitable, just, and ambitious climate agenda? And if not, how can we get there? So I see on my screen that Harjit is first. So Harjit, I'll open it up to you.
Thank you so much, Brenna, and real pleasure to be here joining this panel. So yeah, I think we do welcome US back into Paris Agreement, and Biden administration definitely has demonstrated the willingness to be part of the global community and act on the climate crisis that we are facing. But they are nowhere near the fair share target that US administration should have put forward. They're talking about reducing emissions to around 50% by 2030 based on their emissions in 2005. But the reality is, if you look at the fair share, and civil society has put forward a report, they should be bringing down their emissions by 195%. Let me repeat, 195%, which we know technically may not be possible. So what civil society is suggesting, that you domestically reduce emissions by 70% and provide financial support to developing countries to reduce emissions on your behalf in developing countries. And that's where the money has to go for clean energy transfer as well as how communities can deal with climate impacts. So US is still very far from its fair share target. Even on finance, I'm sure colleagues are going to talk about it. It really doesn't meet its fair share. So I think the question is it's not what US is doing in absolute numbers. We need to compare that with US historical emissions. We know that it is the largest historic emitter in the world, and whether it is responding to that responsibility or not, I think that's the big question. Let me stop here and allow other colleagues to chip in.
Yes, thank you for that, Harshit. I think Krishnal, if you wanted to pick up where Harshit left off.
Thanks, Brenna. Hello, everyone. As Harshit has already mentioned, the updated US government's Paris Agreement target of 50 to 52% by reduction by 2030 below 2005 levels. Although it's a significant step in improvement from the previous commitments that it had on Paris Agreement, but it still falls short of what is needed. For the US, an emissions reduction target of at least 57 to 70% below 2005 levels by 2030 would have been consistent with a 1.5 degree pathway and put the country on a better track on achieving its 2050 net zero emissions target. So with this, although it's an improvement, US is still far behind. There are other countries who have also stepped up, and with the previous administration, there has been a gap of 4 years, and US has to catch up, and it just cannot come now and say it's going to lead. There's a gap, and it needs to catch up with the other countries and with what it could have done in the past 4 years. So it could have been better. I'll let others add on to that as well.
Agreed, it definitely could have been so much better. And so I will pass it now to Jesse. That is next on my list.
Oh yeah, I personally agree with the other panelists that indeed US has gone to a very remarkable step of about 50 to 52 reduction rate. But we believe that is not enough. It's not been inside the Paris Agreement for the last 4 years. So it has got a lot to do, And believe me, US has been known as the pacemaker all the time. So that its commitment will discourage or encourage as many people to do the same as well.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I think we are going to move on to question number 2, and I'll hand it over to, we can hear from Jesse first, and then Krishnal, and I believe we're still hoping for Iman to be able to join as she's having some technical difficulties. Oh, there she is. Awesome. Okay, well, we'll let her get situated and just get to the second question. So we want to talk a little bit about funding, because money is kind of the thing that makes the world go around. And I wanted to talk about how we wanted to talk about how the Biden administration has also announced that they would double climate finance by 2024 in their International Climate Finance Plan. And so for our participants, to put that into a little bit of context, the US's Pentagon budget is nearly $800 billion, and that is what they're hoping to achieve by fiscal year 22. But their climate funds would only be 5.7 billion total, with 1.5 billion set aside for adaptation over the next 3 years. So 800 billion versus 5 billion, that is like a huge difference between those two. The bottom line is that the US owes money for adaptation, for mitigation, for loss and damage. And so Jesse, if you wanted to answer this question, how do you feel about the US's financial commitments right now? What is the responsibility of the US and other northern countries to build capacity and support for frontline communities?
Oh yeah. Okay. Yeah. I'd love to inform everyone out there that people in the global south, in the developing countries like Uganda, the biggest fail that we have had for climate justice has been basically to leave climate change to the experts and the scientists. What am I referring to? I'm basically referring to the level of lack of information by the young people. So the US really putting up just a very small budget for basically financing and adaptation. It's actually a very big disappointment. Like we said earlier, they've not been in the game for the last 4 years. And they're coming in here, they're the largest emitters, and they're just committing a very small budget. And when you come back to Africa or the low developing countries, the countries in the global south, we believe there is a lot of work to do, and that financing is just not enough, really. Thank you.
Thanks, Jesse. So Iman, if you're ready to jump in, I know you just joined, and I can repeat the question is, how do you feel about the US's financial commitments right now, and what is the responsibility of the US and other northern countries to build capacity and support for frontline communities?
Yeah, thanks, Brenna. Can you guys hear me? I've been having a bit of a technical challenge the whole time. Yeah, so when it comes to climate finance, it's a very critical conversation to have, especially in the times of COVID and the current pandemic that we're going through. The developing countries are facing, challenges with the global pandemic as well as the climate crisis. So it's a twofold challenge, and that just makes it so much more pertinent to have this conversation at this time. And the vulnerability that these countries are experiencing is just not due to their actions or their behaviors. It's just a circumstance of where they are geographically, or a vulnerability due to lack of resources or insufficient finances. And just the assurance of climate support would allow these countries to cushion themselves and defend themselves from the challenges that they're facing with the climate crisis, as well as just efficiently plan to adapt and to just support themselves in the future. So some things need to be addressed more efficiently, like access to climate finance, as well as the systems that are around reporting and accessing these finances, determining who gets what when. All these systems need to be made more clearer to allow the developing countries to know what they can get when and how they should report, and just to make the whole process more efficient. So that would make tracking and tackling of climate change more efficient. So definitely there needs to be more systems put in place around climate finance. So yeah, that's a challenge that is going on in regards to climate action. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that, Iman. Definitely lots of challenges, especially for northern countries to have to take the responsibility for. I think I will open this question, the same question up to, to Krishnail.
Sure. Adequate and accessible financing is key. Developing countries have not met their commitments to provide $100 billion annually in climate finance by 2020 to address the needs of the developing countries. The shortfall is likely to be about $67.1 billion per year. To rebuild confidence, developed country leaders need to commit to put more new climate finance pledges by COP26 that make up for this past shortfall. In addition, developed country leaders also need to signal that they will live up to their continuing climate finance commitments to provide at least $100 billion annually in climate finance for up to 2025, as called by the Paris Agreement. During the Biden Climate Summit, I liked what the New Zealand Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern said, and she said, like, the international community must do the following 4 things. 1, put a price on carbon. 2, make climate-related financial disclosures mandatory. 3, end fossil fuel subsidies. Globally, fossil fuel subsidies total up to 500 billion USD a year. That's about 5 times the current annual climate finance goals. Imagine what we could do if these subsidies could be diverted to help achieving the climate goals, climate financing needs. And she also added, we need to have more finance for adaptation work in the vulnerable countries. The president of Marshall Islands also added to that point, where he said 50% of climate financing should go towards adaptation needs. Coming back to the Biden administration's contributions, telling up, as we said earlier, the doubling up of its efforts would total up to, I think, about 5.1 billion a year, sorry, 5.1 billion up to the end of the Biden administration's first term. So what the Biden administration could have contributed to at least $8 billion to the Green Climate Fund as to undo the previous US administration's efforts to defund the Green Climate Fund. So there's still a shortfall to the commitments that was made during this summit.
Agreed. And in talking about like what some of those fossil fuel subsidies could be put towards, our next question is how, without those funds put towards some real climate actions, we have communities around the world that suffer from loss and damages. So at the beginning of this year, the privatized energy within Texas led to that outage where 4.5 million homes and businesses were left without electricity for several days because the fossil fuel equipment was too frozen to work. And because all of those companies are privatized, they could not access any of the other public electricity that was outside of Texas. And so if Harjit, you could go into a little bit about the loss and damages that are occurring outside of the US.
Sure, Bernardo. This is a very important question, and I think I will use the opportunity to, in fact, unpack and connect with what has already been said, particularly in terms of US NDCs, US climate targets, to put it simply. We need to understand the continuum of climate action, or what happens when there is inaction. The reason we are facing these climate impacts is because of the inaction we have seen over the last few decades. We as a global community failed to mitigate, which means reducing emissions and protecting our forest, which affected. So on one hand, we could see that impacts were rising, and we also did not sufficiently invest into adaptation, which is the second pillar of climate action. So on one hand, impacts have been rising. On the other hand, not enough attention was given to prepare for these disasters. Now, when I say prepare, which means you need to retrofit your infrastructure, you need to build dikes, you need to prepare for such disasters, Brenna, that you are talking about. You know, you need to have all your basic systems in place, be it electricity, education, health, care. Now, that did not happen. So what we are suffering right now is loss and damage. That is now known as the third pillar of climate action. So we need to really understand the continuum, because we did not do sufficient mitigation. We did not invest into a proper adaptation. And now we have reached a situation where we are seeing much more loss and damage. You know, I come from India, and that's where I'm based. And if I speak of India and South Asia, you know, clearly the impacts that we are seeing, it's happening because of the political failure to limit global warming to safer levels. So what is happening? We are seeing droughts, floods, typhoons. We are seeing intensification of all these weather events. We have seen prolonged dry spells that are responsible for recent forest fires in India and Nepal. crops are dying, and farmers are not even able to plant because of drought. They don't have sufficient irrigation systems, and there are places where floods are washing away their assets and entire households. Landslides are burying entire villages. Now, that's the situation we face. And local communities, because they do not have resources, their coping mechanisms are failing, because now disasters have become a lot more frequent and their intensity has increased. Earlier, they could recover from one disaster. There was time between two disasters, and they were not as strong as they are right now. And because they don't have local mechanisms, coping mechanisms, we have also seen that is leading to displacement and forced migration, which we should see it as an epitome of climate impacts. So because we were not supported earlier to prepare for it, and there is no sufficient money going in as part of humanitarian action, communities are forced to migrate. There was a recent study by ActionAid and Climate Action Network South Asia, and the model says that we are going to see 63 million people displaced or forced to migrate by 2050 if we continue the same emission trajectory. Now, this is where it connects with mitigation. This is where it connects with inadequacy of policies to keep people where they are, and respecting their right to stay or right to move. And this number that I'm talking about is only linked to slow onset events like sea level rise and water stress and crop yield reductions, ecosystem loss and drought. And I'm not even talking about numbers which also run into millions, where people are going to be affected by floods and cyclones. So it's a real dire situation in the global south. And in terms of money, as Krishnil and others were talking about, it's not really adequate. Let me just say one number. There are several studies, and as per one study, we will be seeing economic cost of loss and damage to the tune of $290 billion to $580 billion in developing countries by 2030. Now, that's the scale we are talking about. Now, adaptation needs $280 billion by 2030 every year, and $500 billion by 2050. Now, when we talk about numbers that US administration is putting forward, is nowhere near what is required. And when we talk about the biggest historic emitter, which is responsible for more than a quarter of emissions cumulatively, these numbers really don't add up. I think this is where we need to look at US action compared to what is needed and what is its fair share.
Thank you for that, Harshit. Yeah, I think it's a lot of lack of funds in one place and too much funds in another place. And especially when you think about the US and the damage that a lot of the fossil fuel projects that are done here can have the effects around the world is huge. And I really thank you for sharing a lot of that with us. And now I wanted to open it up to Krishnil to talk a little bit about the loss and damages as well that occur outside the US.
Thanks, Prerna. Since Harshit has also already introduced the displacement due to climate and loss and damage issues, I wanted to share about situations here in the Pacific. Internal displacement within a country in the Pacific Islands are already happening. The Fijian government's vulnerability assessments have identified that 45 villages in Fiji would need to be relocated due to climate impacts. 4 of those villages have already been relocated, and a few more are in the process of being considered to be the next ones to be relocated. But with a couple of years ago, the conversations within the Pacific Island region was that save Tuvalu, save the world. But like now, the conversations within the region has changed, and people do not want to relocate between countries. So movement or displacement from one country to another country is not an option for us. But that's the most last scenario, that and most extreme scenario that we would like to face. There are obviously economic aspects of loss and damage issues, and Harshit has put some figures to those economic aspects. But for us, there's also another dimension of non-economic aspects, and those aspects are related to culture, language, the way of life, and our identity that identifies us as the Pacific Islanders, which are very, very key to our way of life. And that sort of also needs to be quantified. There's one thing that I want to also link here is the issue of climate security, which was also discussed, one of the topics at the Biden summit. So the Pacific Island leaders 2 years ago made it clear that climate change represents the single greatest threat to the livelihood, security, and well-being of the Pacific Island people. Rising sea levels, king tides, floodings, droughts, extreme weather events threaten to overwhelm the infrastructure, disrupt economies, displace populations, and place significant strains on the governance of small island countries. Climate change impacts our food security, water security, health security, and our whole collective security as well. So there's a need for us to focus on those security aspects in the Pacific Islands region as well, and we're trying to figure out how do we address that. It was good to see that conversations on climate security also taking place at the Biden summit, climate summit, but the way of the approach of the U.S. government at the moment is that it's addressing it from the military point of view, and its threat on national security and conflict management. So for us, it's not about military action, but it's more of about food, water, and health security aspects. So I just wanted to share that linkages to one of the topics that was discussed at the Biden summit as well.
Thank you for that, Krishnal. Yeah, I think a lot of the talk about fighting climate action is a lot of militaristic terms in it, and it also is kind of a militaristic take on it within the US as well. And you could see that through some of the things that have happened in my homelands, for example. Throughout the past few years, my families at Standing Rock have fought to preserve our water from the contaminants of the Dakota Access Pipeline that could burst and make its way to our main water source that is on our reservation. And this is a decision that was made by the privatized gas sector to endanger the water that is the main water source to our reservation, so as to avoid the water source that goes to Bismarck, which is a predominantly white city that resides about an hour outside of this reservation. And this is a movement that was started bringing attention to this pipeline within North Dakota. It was a movement that was led by the youth, actually, from my tribe, and they started a run from North Dakota to DC in honor of bringing attention to the environmental injustices and racism that were taking place here in the US. And so I was wondering, Alvaro, if you could tell us a little bit about how lack of access to resources limits local issues, and maybe talk about how the faces that we see around climate issues, they rarely ever include BIPOC island states or vulnerable youth, and how can we change that?
Hello, thanks for having me today. So I think this is a very complicated matter, but I remember, for example, when I was in COP, we have the white activists having a lot of attention. But when we see some people from Brazilian tribes that were there to complain about how the government is attacking their places to dry oil and other carbon emission materials, they were just taken for people saying, hey, can I have a photo with you? Because they use their normal clothes. They are not forced to dress the other people. And in that case, people don't respect that. I think that is a major issue, because it's like oh, you are dressed with your clothes that are from your tribe, for your culture. They are always questioning and say, hey, can we take a photo? But they are not interested in how you want to say, what you want to say, why you needed this support in your tribe, in your place, wherever you are. That is a big problem. It's like if you're white in these spaces, normally people hear what you want to say. If you are not, normally you just receive a photo requests. I think that is a bigger problem. And the other is how rich companies, rich countries, rich corporations doesn't respect the rights from other people, the BIPOC people, the indigenous communities, original people we told in South America, people that was here before the conquer of European countries in the continent. And these people is not respected, and they don't have the money, for example, for hire a good lawyer, because it's like you have this environmentalist lawyer, then is trying to do something, and the company have a big law firm with 50 lawyers that are against you. So it's very difficult for them to defend in the legal systems, and that perpetuates the inequality between companies and the people that actually need help and actually need to protect their lands. Also, is a patriarchal problem, or main societies are constructed in patriarchal way. And when I was in UNCCD, I figured out that some small tribes in different countries that are in a matriarchal system are very best than the other communities on protecting their lands. And that is a thing that we need to address. We need to address that in the climate it's important to respect the minorities, to respect the BIPOC, and also to address climate gender equality. That is also very important. I think one of the major problems here is that we still are thinking of how rich people and rich countries control all the space. When we see this summit, we see the 40 richest countries in the world. Most of them are major emitters, others are not, but they are still the rich kids of the neighborhood. That is why they are there. In some point, when small island countries say, hey, why we are not invited? They say, oh, you are not a major emitter. So this position means a conflict between who is suffering and who is offering to resolve. And this is a problem because rich people and rich countries are always causing the problems, and now they are promising to resolve it. And we, in the small countries, in the small island countries, in the South countries, less developed countries, we are always the object, never the subject of this. We are always affected countries. We are always the people that need to receive help, but they are designing how they want to help us. And that is a bigger problem because we want to have a voice. We want to say, hey, we need these ways of solving the problems. We need these ways of help. For example, we need technology. We don't need wait for the people to come here and teach us how to save our lands. We need the tools and the knowledge of BIPOC people and the Native Americans in all Americas, South, Central, and North America. That knowledge is very important, and is being ignored for many years. So in this case, I am just seeing the rich kids in the neighborhood saying, hey, we are going to help you, but we are going to see how we could help you. And the other problem is like the same people than in the last COPs, not just in the UNCCD, in the UNFCCC, but also in UNCCD, the same countries that say, hey, we are blocking this, now they are promising that they are not blocking anymore. I don't know. I think they are just doing promises that don't make any sense at all, because they are saying, hey, we are putting all the money in the transformation of the US, for example, to electric-based country by 2050. But at the same time, they are building new pipelines. That makes no sense. So I think that is the major problems now. Thank you.
Thank you, Alvaro. And so a lot of the issues that you brought up, something, a term that we have within the climate movement to talk about this is kind of climate reparations. And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how the US and other northern and developed countries can take full responsibility for their role in the environmental racism that they perpetuated throughout the world, and how that fits into a colonialist and imperialist structure.
So I think the first thing is to recognize their history. And I am talking about old imperialism and also modern imperialism, because when we think in the old imperialism or classic, we talk about UK and France and Germany, Holland, Netherlands, and other countries then were the major emitters and also the major colonialists in the colonialist time. But today we are also having imperialism. The US, China, Russia are doing imperialist movements in their areas of influence, and they are trying to put the people as objects and not as subjects. They are like, we need to address then the overconsumption of these countries is affecting the other countries. They are always asking for more and more and more products. These products need to be produced in some place, are produced in our countries, or countries take the contamination, take the pollution, and take all the bad part of that productions, and later they enjoy the products. So I think in a fierce way, they need to reduce the overconsumption of the rich countries. Also, we need to address the problem that in the last 20 years, always more and more people is rich, and these people is more and more rich every day, and the poor people is always more and more poor. So that is a major problem, because we are having a bigger and bigger gap every time. So the colonialism, I think, is not over yet. It's just modernizing. So we could not say that colonialism already passed. They are already still affecting us. Today is just modernizing. So I think the overconsumption need to stop. They need to address how much damage they already did, not just the damage that they need to stop than they are doing now, but they need to address how many damage they already did, how they kill people in other countries, how they rob people in other countries, and all of that need to be solved and recognized for them, for the fears. And second, they need to give more space to women, because women are transforming the spaces. Women, like if we say different countries, for example, in the response of COVID, the countries that have women in power are doing better than the countries that have men in power. And I think with the climate change is the same. We need to change our structures and recognize the damage that we already did and the damage that we are still doing.
Thank you, Alvaro. Yeah, and in thinking about why it's so important to address the damage that we have done, that rich countries have done, it's also that we can build a a better future, a more equitable future. And so, and to bring it back around a little bit to the summit, at the summit yesterday, President Moon Jae-in from South Korea announced that they would end their overseas financing of new coal plants. And we also heard from Canada that they promised a 40 to 45% emissions reduction below 2005 levels by 2030. And while the leaders were patting themselves on the back at the summit for announcing these, a lot of activists were speaking out and saying that this is not enough. And so I would like to ask Iman if you could talk to us a little bit about how countries can do better. What more do the US and other northern countries need to do to build an equitable future for the planet?
Yeah, of course, Brenna. So the summit yesterday, while the US took a fast step in decidedly the future that we want in the right step, and they just took that very fast step of taking us where we want to be, there's still some things that they need to do better. They need to move with more urgency, first of all, because a lot of the things that was mentioned were not as urgently addressed as we would have liked, as with the swiftness that we would have needed. This urgency needs direct action from the US and other developing countries to hit the nail on the head directly. The US envoy, climate envoy, John Kerry, he said that what the US did is not enough, or what the US is planning to do is not enough, but it's the best that the US can do today. And this is difficult to commend. As someone from a developing country, this is very challenging for me to commend, because we don't have that time. We don't have the time to wait for the US to get its, its finances and its leadership and just organize itself so that they can act to the sense of urgency that we need. We don't have that time because there's typhoons happening in Mozambique. There's, locusts in Kenya. There's just all these climatic events that are happening to developing countries who are not to blame for this. They're just being affected by these activities, so by these climatic actions. So we need countries like the US to take more direct action in dealing with this with a sense of urgency that acknowledges that there is an issue and there is no time. So that the countries yesterday, most of the countries did not speak about oil or gas or coal. These very things that they agree and they acknowledge are the problem were barely addressed. It was just speaking of hopes and dreams of eventually phasing out fossil fuels. And while this is important, it's important to, have a positive outlook in life and to think positively of the future. We need to put in place rapid transition timetables to phase out fossil fuels. We need to induce confidence in the countries that are looking to the US for leadership by putting in place specific timelines for when the US will move away from coal and oil and gas and move to renewable energy. Very few states put timelines, and those that put timelines are very commendable because it's what we need. We need specific times and specific actions to mention that fossil fuel is not an option for these countries and they'll move away from it. So we would have definitely preferred more direct language, more direct comments from the US, as well as just addressing the root cause of the problem, which is fossil fuels. And majority of these countries agree that fossil fuels are the issue, but mentioning it seems to be the problem. Just dancing around the issue seems to be the norm with majority of these countries. So acknowledging a swift transition is what we need. Just like when nuclear weapons were the biggest threat to human life. Now we can all agree that fossil fuels are the biggest threat to human life, and fossil fuels causing climate change is the biggest threat to human life. So we need the countries to do what they did when nuclear weapons were the biggest threat to humanity and come together and have direct action against it. We need to account for the countries that have fossil fuel, and we need to stop the use of fossil fuels as just the largest share of fossil fuels right now. I think over 80% globally is from fossil fuels, according to the IEA, I think. And just these numbers are staggering, especially for developing countries, because there is no time to slowly just transition. We need to do it quickly, but we also need to bear in mind that we need to do it in a manner that is that is very just and inclusive and equitable, because a lot of transitions that have happened in the world, the industrial revolutions and all of these just quick human development have left certain groups marginalized, and these marginalizations have just compounded to make it worse and worse as we go along. So the transition definitely needs to be more direct. Direct language in general is definitely important. The Paris Agreement does not mention fossil fuels anywhere, doesn't mention gas or oil or coal. Even the general term fossil fuel is nowhere to be seen. So definitely direct language from the developed countries is important, because many climate vulnerable countries need the US and the developed states to face the issues with direct action. So definitely there needs to be deliberate non-proliferation of fossil fuels. There needs to be a swift transition to a just and equitable future for developing countries and developing communities, and just preventing further marginalization of these communities. So the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty will ensure that countries stick to their promises, unlike what is happening now, where countries are just throwing around, we will give 100 billion, we will do this, we will do that, but there is no form of accountability, because there is nothing on paper that binds them. There is nothing that ensures that you don't touch the fuel, you leave it in the ground, keep it where it is, and focus on transitioning to renewable energy, because there is no time to fix this later down the line. It has to be now. So definitely we're at the cusp of a momentous change, especially with now Biden coming into power and a lot of countries now following his leadership and just deciding to have high ambition. But those ambitions need to be put down in a strict way, just to make sure that people can be held accountable and just transition to renewable energy. Thank you, Brenna.
Thank you, Iman. And so in talking about some of the different initiatives and campaigns that we can use in order to hold these countries accountable, I wanted to open it back up to Jesse, if you wanted to talk about the ways that US and other northern countries need to build an equitable future for the planet.
Oh yeah, like we have a movement that we've created called Earth Power. Now, here basically in this movement, we're making the fight a bit more specific. Like Iman has been speaking about in the summit, no one was speaking about the fossil fuels, oil and gas. But it's quite shocking to learn that about 100 companies still cause 77% of the world emissions. Now, like everyone has been fighting for climate justice, but we don't know the root cause of this. And we know it's oil and gas, but we barely fight. Now, in this movement, we basically focus on ending the new fossil fuel infrastructure development. We work to stop the construction of coal, natural gas, and oil projects immediately. Begin the transition to renewable energy. We work to empower communities to shift from extractive to regenerational power, like water, like solar. And yeah, and something really important here is also we unite an accessible youth movement beyond striking. We engage communities, building storytelling, arts based on activism and social media. Now, here we share stories of people that are doing so much. I mean, if you speak about what the emissions are doing in your country, you share. Now, the young people out there, they can know what they can do and how much the effect they're having. But I also really want to talk about something else, which is so important here, about how the United States really can help, can do more. I feel in the summit, something really lacked was the US being direct on how they can provide direct leadership and technical assistance to help other countries transform from the energy systems to reduce the gas house emissions. Thank you.
Thank you, Jesse, for that. And we have dropped some links into the chat so that you can check out some of the campaigns and initiatives that we talked about for that last question. And so I just wanted to thank all of our panelists for the important knowledge and wisdom that you all have shared with us. I'm really thankful to have gotten to know you all and to hear you speak. And I wanted to turn over to the questions that have been going in the chat and then in the Q&A. And so the first question that we have was, if any of our panelists have thoughts about how we can build a stronger movement for international climate finance in the US, and take action in solidarity with our comrades in the global South to increase the US's international climate finance. And so I will leave it to the speakers if one of you wants to raise your hand or unmute.
Hello, yes. Let me go first. So I think one important idea is that already is around some initiatives to support people in the global South. For example, I know for sure that Plan for the Planet have a program, then you could donate money and they people from global South could apply to projects to use that money on planting trees or in building stronger communities with more resilience and stuff like that. They're still smaller grants because they're not like having a lot of money, but for example, that is one way that you could use. Then creating a fund that is administrated for NGO to people in the global South to apply for that fund and use it. I know for sure also then there's an NGO called Reserva, then is from amazing women, then it's called Kelly Brothers. Then they buy a place in Ecuador and they have a reserve there with that place that they buy, and they maintain this place so they could have different biodiversity measures in that place than they buy, with people from the US donating money to them to this. And also, I think it's very important that we need to understand that most of the COPs has been in the global north. And normally, for example, if they are in Europe, they are going to be full of people from the global north and Europeans. And in some point, it's very useful to have the help of the people in the global north in the US to bring people from global South to these conferences, because it's a place when we could raise the voice of the more marginalized people. I know for sure, for example, care about climate. We always try to support people from global South to attend these conferences because it's part of our ideals to have an equitable presence in the conference between global North and global South. And I think that are some of the stuff that you could do. And I know that the other panelists could have a lot of other ideas.
Yes, does anyone else, any of our panelists want to answer that question about international climate finance? Harjeet?
Yeah, just to add to what Alvaro already said. So the civil society report that we are talking about has already put a number, which is the most conservative number for now. If you look at the fair share of the US, it's $800 billion to be paid by the US by 2030, which should be equally divided between mitigation, adaptation, and loss and damage. And if you look at other estimates, it actually reaches trillion. So this is the bare minimum that US should be doing and delivering on in the next 9 years. However, if you look at the announcements that are being made and what even Envoy John Kerry has been talking about, is depending more on the private sector. And that is really worrying. How can we have confidence in companies who are driven by profit margins when we are not seeing the real zero targets from businesses, And these polluting industries are responsible for the crisis. So instead of depending on them for finance, we should be taxing them. We should be shifting finance away from fossil fuel subsidies. We should be applying international air passenger levy. There is a concept of climate damages tax on fossil fuel companies on their per ton of output. There's also financial transaction tax. So there have been many ideas how to raise finance, which will not only reach billions, but trillions. And this is not going to affect the economy. This is going to rather penalize these polluting industries. And that's what is needed. But John Kerry is still looking the other way. And what as civil society and movements need to do is to really take this issue head on. Because if we want that transition in developing countries who have massive development deficit, you cannot expect them to divert money from education, healthcare, and infrastructure to now talk about greening their economy when millions of people are still not able to have access to basic food and energy. So what you need is international cooperation, and that is the most important ingredient for the just transition that we are talking about. And Iman very eloquently talked about what is needed for just transition. It cannot happen unless we have international cooperation. So some of these numbers that US civil society has put forward, the conservative figure of $800 billion. I think what US groups need to do is to popularize this number, normalize these numbers, and point towards some of the options on how this money can be raised. And majority of it has to be public finance. We cannot depend on the same private corporations who are largely responsible for the climate crisis.
Thank you, Harshit. It's so important to think about the financial in talking about international climate finance and needing international cooperation and making sure that when we try to build back better, that we're not just building back the same infrastructure. And that's so important. So thank you for sharing that with us. Did anyone else want to talk about that question? Because I think we have one more question otherwise, but I just want to pause a moment to see if anyone else wanted to. No? Okay, cool. So the second question that someone submitted is, why do Southern nations tend to experience more impacts with climate change than Northern nations like the US? I'm not sure if anyone, Iman.
If I could hop in, Rana. There's many factors that cause developing countries or global South countries to be more vulnerable to climate change. The first thing is how they're placed geographically. Just the tropics have more just erratic weather patterns. So with an increase in global temperatures, just a 1 degree in temperatures can cause the atmosphere to hold about 7 times more moisture. So this just, for an area that is already full of moisture and humidity, it just worsens the situation, and there's floods and there's monsoons and just a lot of erratic weather patterns in the area. Secondly, another reason that compounds to this is insufficient finance to cushion themselves from climate change. So a lot of these communities rely on nature directly for their livelihoods. So the rivers, the lakes, they live just directly from nature. And so once climate change starts affecting the main source of their livelihoods, it makes sense that the subsequent reaction would be that they are affected themselves worse than the people who have industrialized to further levels that they don't have to be in contact with nature constantly. So those two factors compounded make these communities so vulnerable to climate change, which just makes it worse because they didn't do much to cause climate change. I think all of Africa is responsible for less than 4% of the carbon emissions currently. So, but the most vulnerable communities reside on the continent. Just the compounded factors make it so that they're so vulnerable that they cannot protect themselves, and they cannot protect themselves because they're vulnerable. So it's a cyclical issue that they're caught in the middle of, but they had nothing to do with. So it's just, when you think about it, when you step away from it, it's just so many factors that need to be addressed urgently, because in the monsoon, the typhoon Idai, I think in Mozambique, so many people died, yet Mozambique is point something % responsible for climate change. but the monsoon was being caused, the typhoon was being caused by increasing global temperatures that caused the atmosphere to hold more moisture that led to the extreme weather patterns. So just, it can be very disconcerting to think about, but there's hope because all of the countries now are more cognizant of climate change. It's just a matter of pushing that final barrier, just that final step of, we acknowledge that there's climate change, but most of us refuse to acknowledge what caused climate change. So just say it, say the words coal, oil, fossil fuels. That is the reason we're having climate change. That is the reason all of these climatic effects are happening. So just say it, and like Harjit said, normalize it, and then maybe we can start to address it. Once we say it, maybe we can start addressing the issue. Thank you.
Thank you, Iman. Alvaro, did you want to go?
Hello. So, I think I could add then these less developed countries and the communities then lives in marginalization and poverty have not money for the design of their communities, the design in terms of adaptation. So sometimes, for example, it is a thing that happens here in Chile in the last years. Then we have some communities in the north that normally is a desert, like the driest desert on the world for the last 300 years. And some years ago, we had a flood there. That makes no sense because you say, oh, this is the driest place on the earth. And later you say, and we have a flood. So makes no sense. And these people obviously was not prepared at all. And their community was, in some part of this community was poor people that made their homes when they could construct their homes. And I think that is a very important matter also for small islands countries. You build your home when you could do it, when you have the money to do it. And that means then sometimes you build your place in a place that is climate dangerous, then have a lot of climate risk because you are building in the side of that river that could be flooded or could be just taking away your home, but that is the place that you could afford. And I think that is why sometimes we see that southern countries are more affected. Sometimes we have climate moments or climate events that are the same with another part of the world, but this part of the world, the most developed countries are more prepared because they are building their communities in a safer way. They are more adapted to this. Is the example, for example, of Netherlands. Netherlands is below the sea level, and they have no problem because they have a lot of infrastructure that they build during years to avoid and the flood kill their people. But now in the rest of the world, we have not that money for build that kind of infrastructure. So when the sea when the sea level rise, and when we have floods or big rains, we are almost dead in some communities. We are seeking for bodies later than these events. So I think that is one of the differences. That poverty also make us more vulnerable to these extreme weather patterns.
Thank you, Alvaro. Harjit, I see your hand is raised.
Yeah, I know there's a question, but I'm quite tempted to add one more element to what Iman and Alvaro already covered. I think when we talk about the lack of capacity in developing countries, we should also look at it from a very systemic perspective. We should also highlight how the inequality that exists between the global north and global south has been caused by systemic racism, colonialism, and the ongoing neoliberalism, which we referred to in this conversation a while ago. And that has led to resources going from global south to global north. And all the infrastructure that we see has been built, using racism and colonialism and neoliberal policies. And those trade policies continue. They're taking far more money away from developing countries and then giving back, change in the form of aid. And I think that's what we really need to challenge. We need to challenge the trade practices. We need to challenge the economic policies, debt. Iman was talking about Mozambique being hit by twin cyclones in 2019. And imagine with the kind of emissions Mozambique has, as she was saying, it is hit by two cyclones and then is forced to take loan from IMF to rebuild and repair its infrastructure and recover from climate impacts. This is outrageous. So a country that is hardly responsible for the crisis, which has been caused by the same neoliberal policies, now is dependent on that system to take loan, and it has already been spending millions to service older loans. So I think we need to really challenge the system itself, which is making them vulnerable, and everything that Alvaro and Iman said in terms of lack of capacity and lack of resources and lack of technology. So, that inequality also exists. So I just wanted to add those points.
Thank you so much for that, Harjeet. Yeah, I completely agree in talking about, the socioeconomic inequalities that are happening all around the world. And that this is stuff that has been happening for hundreds of years, ever since, all of these different countries have gone to other countries and claimed that this is their home and removed indigenous peoples and then introduced their monarchies and certain monetary systems as well, that this is something that has been built kind of from the ground up. And so if we wanted to bring these sorts of talks more into the US and talk about how the solution can also happen from the ground up, we have a question from the Q&A about how US domestic climate activist groups can motivate their members to focus on international climate policy goals. Because as we see, this conversation is happening here, but it's not happening nearly enough throughout the US and other northern countries. And so if anyone wanted to take a crack at that question. Maybe if you wanted to talk a little bit about the type of work that you're doing. Oh, Krishnil.
Yeah, I think I'd allow me to go first. I mean, others can add on to that. I think there's a few things. The first thing, one thing that I've noticed is that climate activists or youth or people in general in the United States are pretty much unaware of the climate impacts and the vulnerability issues of the Global South, beyond just the impacts within the US jurisdictions. So one thing could be about education and the need to raise awareness between your members around the linkages between the international climate impacts and the policies and how crucial it is to the US domestic issues and challenging the US administration and the key role that US administration plays into the whole global.
Krishna, I think you're muted. Yeah.
Sorry. Yeah. So one of the things that probably could be the education aspects. Organizations like Care About Climate is working on that, which is US based, and providing linkages with international or global climate policy spaces. So that that cross exchanges needs to happen as well. So exchange between activists, youth groups in the United States with those of us outside, to have that knowledge exchange, that understanding of collaboration. In addition to that, to the knowledge exchange, I believe that there could be campaigns, projects, and activities that could be done better if linked with people from the global South. And something which Alvaro also added earlier on is not having people from the impacted countries as a side piece, but there as a collaborative partner, because we need to address climate change collectively as a whole as well, and not as separate in silos. So bring that point of what Alvaro said. We are often used as side pieces when we're brought into the developed countries to speak about climate change, and then after that it's and that's it. Like there's nothing happens beyond that. So that collaboration, that partnerships needs to be better defined and happen between the activists, the people in the United States, and then those from the outside of the United States.
Thank you, Krishnal. I wonder if anyone else wants to take a crack at that question.
Yes,
Alvaro?
just I think 2 quick comments. I think education is one of the major necessities in the US. I studied exchange program in the US in 2014. And I was so shocked because I was talking with my professor in the university about climate change, their impacts in the tier world countries, in the less developed countries. And there was a person approaching to us saying, hey, that is a Chinese hoax. That is a lie. That is just stupid ideas to take the US to not being more developed than we are now. And that kind of ideas obviously came from a really poor education. Like, and that person was a university student. So I think when we saw then people then already passed through all the education and actually made to college, and that person thinks that climate change is not real, that is an educational problem that is in the base of all the education of the US system of education. That is one problem that we could solve a little bit, and every time will be bigger and bigger, or work in solving this with our NGOs trying to do the most of our work in educational matters. And the other thing I think will be added to that and be added to what Krishna say is then we need to understand and we need to show a reality check to the US people and to European countries. And what is a reality check? They go to South American countries, to the Caribbean, to Africa, to the Asia, to take vacations, to being in beautiful places in the best part of the year. And later you need to say, hey, remember that people that was nice to you in that place when you were lost? Some people bring you to your hotel, was nice in the service there. Okay, they are now dead. They are now homeless because of climate change. They need this reality check. We need to show them this stuff happens in the world. I think the only reality check that the US is having in the last years was in the first place Katrina, and the other one was this last storm in Texas. Was the only time that people in the US is seeing the effect of climate change being more and more real to them. But they need to understand that in the other countries we are suffering that every year, and in some places the hurricane season is the time that you are hoping that no one's in your family or homeless or dead because of climate change. We need this reality check.
Thank you for that, Alvaro. And it's a lot of heavy stuff that we're talking about right now, this taking responsibility for and being able to recognize all the increasing and really deadly damage that the US and other northern countries have caused around the world. Harshit, I see that your hand is up. I wonder if you wanted to follow that.
Yeah, very quickly, there's a question in the chat which is about colonialism and imperialism being a non-starter in the polarized US political landscape. Couple of years ago, even climate change was a non-starter. A couple of years ago, even discussion about climate finance was a non-starter. And it's not in the US, it was a non-starter in many parts of the world. But look at the way how we have get around. I think we cannot hide these realities and these historical injustices just because it is not politically palatable. We have to take these issues head on. We remember in 1992 when this framework convention on climate change was negotiated, President George S.W. Bush said, the American way of life is not up for negotiation, but now it is up for negotiation. It was politically not palatable then. It was a non-starter then. It is the starting point now. We have to question our lifestyles. We have to see who is emitting how much, who is occupying the ecological space. So let us not go by what is politically convenient. Let us speak truth to power. That is what is needed to bring about the change and achieve justice.
Yes, thank you so much. Yeah, I know in growing up there was a lot of things that my mother and my grandmother saw happening in uranium mining on our reservation and coal mining, and those things were stopped and the damage was done, but they were stopped. And that's not something that my grandmother would have seen coming, and it did happen. And it happened because we had these movements from the ground up. We had people joining the political ranks, and we had people who were fighting to be able to protect our brothers and sisters. And we see that happening now. And so we're coming up on the end of our session, but I wanted to take the last 5 minutes to talk a little bit about how some of the young people can get involved and how they can support other young people. And so we have talked a little bit about the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, which is all about ensuring a just transition to clean and low carbon energy and fast tracking a equitable solution in order to achieve that. And so I know we also talked a little bit about the Earth Power campaign from ISEC, and I wonder if there was anything from Care About Climate that you wanted to talk about, Alvaro, or anyone else, if there was something that we wanted to share with everyone before we come to the end.
So in Care About Climate, we have programs on gender, programs on climate education, but I think then we have a lot of NGOs here, and I think a message could be then, you as youth people or activists of any kind, you need to find yourself NGO and go full deep on that NGO to do wherever you can do. If it's small or it's big, that is not important. You are doing your part. Choose an NGO that suit you and go deep there.
Thank you for that, Alvaro. Iman, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I just wanted to speak a bit more about the treaty, just to encourage people to go on the website and interact with the treaty, because I feel like this is a momentous time that we need to involve more people, and especially at the grassroots levels, because the power comes from the people. And if you can put pressure on the legislators and your local leaders and the policy point person in your local communities, I feel like that would make a lot bigger impression than, especially in an African setting. Instead of coming from a Western perspective, I feel like we as Africans should put pressure on our own leaders so that we have a leg to stand on, and we have leverage, and we can protect ourselves, not just having political leverage, but also protecting our very lives as people, not just putting pressure on our politicians so that we can use this as political leverage. So definitely interact with the treaty, and thank you so much for listening. And back to you, Brenna.
Thank you, Iman. Jesse, you have your hand up.
Oh yeah, I just wanted to talk about ISEC. ISEC is an organization that's been there since 2016. And the way we approach matters is that we get national directors from countries, and they're responsible to run activities and campaign in those countries. So we have a call that will be coming up. So if you're interested to work with ISEC, please feel free to represent your country. We're going to train you in activism and leadership, and you could do so well in climate justice. Thank you so much. You can find ISEC on our website, as noted in the chat box.
Thank you so much for joining us, everyone, and for hearing from all of our speakers about all of these amazing actions that are taking place around the world. I want to be mindful of everyone's time and note that we only have like 1 more minute left. And so I just want to acknowledge all of the information and the wisdom that all of our panelists have shared with us, and the places that they have come from and the journeys that they've been on to get to this point so that we could all be here and to hear everything. And I think that it's really important that we're having this talk, and I really appreciate being able to be here. And I want to let everyone know that for those of you who are registered with PowerShift, that the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative is going to be holding another final session tomorrow. I'm sorry, not tomorrow, it's later today at 5:30 p.m. Central Time, and it is called "Do We Need a Global Treaty to Manage a Just Transition?" Thank you again, everyone, for joining, and thank you again to all of our amazing panelists. It's such an honor to have gotten to know you all and to be on this panel and to hear you all speak on these matters. And I think that we are going to take a quick picture before we close down this session. So all of you participants, if you want to hang out and watch us all pose to take a picture, that's cool. But you're also welcome to go to the next session or take a break or anything else. But thank you all for joining again. And I wonder who wants to take a screenshot, and we can just send it in an email thread.
I can do it.
Awesome. Okay.
Okay, everyone smile. Oh yeah, thanks Alvaro for the climate sign. Cool. Okay. Okay, I got one. I'm gonna do a second one just in case. And okay, great, thanks. I'll send that out momentarily.
Awesome. Well, thank you again, everyone.